I wish to speak today about two topics, both relatively briefly. First of all, something which is halakha l'ma'aseh in the very near future. I'm referring to Birkat Ahama, the bracha on the sun. Everyone familiar with the bracha that you say on the sun?
Yeah, the 21.
Most people are aware of a bracha that is recited ala hama, Birkat Ahama, once every 28 years. This appears, as we're about to see, in the Lashon, in the language, the statement of the Talmud on the subject, as it is printed before us, and from there it appears in some of the Rishonim, such as the Rambam. Apparently also Rashi was Gores this way, had that reading. But we shall also see that this is not the original and authentic text. It's quite a claim that I'm making now. This is not the correct text. Rambam, as we're about to see, says this, that is the correct text, that you make this bracha once every 28 years. So, to claim that it's not so, one has to have a lot of evidence and proof. So let's begin at the beginning. We have a statement in the Tosefta, in Masechet Barachot, Perek Shishi, one line statement. Haro'et ha'hama, weth ha'levana, weth ha'kochavim, weth ha'mazalot, he who sees the sun, the moon, the stars, and the planets. Omer Baruch Oseh V'Reshith, recites the Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Ha'olam Oseh V'Reshith. The nusach that most people are more familiar with is Oseh Ma'aseh V'Reshith, but that's also not the accurate text. The original text in all sources, including, by the way, in the Talmud printed before us, is Oseh V'Reshith. This appears in the Talmud Bavli, as we're about to see. In Masechet Barachot, Daf Nun Teth, at the top of Nun Teth Amud Beth. So this statement in Tosefta is really cryptic. It doesn't explain very much at all. It just says, if you see the sun, when you see the moon, stars, planets, you say this bracha. Well, what does that mean? You see the sun every day, normally. If it's very cloudy, perhaps you won't see it that day, but normally you see the sun. So does that mean you make the bracha every day? That does not make a lot of sense. Similarly, the moon you don't see in the same fashion every day. Sometimes the moon is very small, sometimes it waxes and wanes. There's a full moon, or there's a crescent moon, or there's no moon. So what is actually being said? So this statement in the Tosefta, Masechet Barachot, really requires much explanation and elaboration. In the Talmud Yerushalmi, Masechet Barachot, in the 9th Perek Tet Halacha Bet, we find the following. It says, Haro'et ha'hama b'tkufatha. This is already new information. It says b'tkufatha. What does that mean? We'll see in a moment. But when you see the sun in a particular mode or time, literally, the question is, what does the word b'tkufatha mean? In its particular time, or at a certain point in its cycle, or what we'll see in a moment. The same also for the moon. When you see the moon, b'tkufatha. And also when you see the sky, the heavens, the blue sky of the day, when they're particularly clear, you say the bracha, the same bracha, Oseh V'Reshith. Amar Rabbi Huna, this is in Yerushalmi, it says, Hadad de Tamar, this refers to the following, B'motha Geshamim Bilevad, Lahal Shelosha Yamim. In other words, you see the sky every day, again. So when are you supposed to say a bracha on seeing the clear sky? When is the sky its clearest? So this is what Rabbi Huna says, after when you've had heavy rainfall, let's say for 3 days, the rain clears the air, and you see the sky more clearly, in a more pristine fashion than normal. then that's called seeing the rakia, the sky, b'teharo, in its purity, in its clearest, most brilliant aspect. Then it goes on to say in the Yerushalmi, Haru'ayat halavana behidusha, he who sees the moon, the new moon, behidusha, says a bracha, different bracha, Baruch mehadesh chodashim. Okay, that's fine. So this has nothing to do, lichora, with what we said a moment before about seeing the levana bitkufata. So there were two things mentioned in the Yerushalmi. One is seeing the levana, the moon, bitkufata. We'll see what that means in a moment. And the other is seeing the levana bihidusha, the new moon. So that the new moon, the bracha for the new moon, most people are familiar with, Mahadesh Chodashim. And for the levana bitkufata, or the sun, hama bitkufata, there's a different bracha, oseh v'reshit. We'll explain. That's what the Yerushalmi has to say. The Talmud Bavli in Masechet Barachot, Daf Nun Taith Amud Bet, states, first of all, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is quoted as saying, making a similar statement with regards to the sky, seeing the clear sky. Haro'eh rakia b'taharatha, he who sees the sky in its clearest aspect, one says the bracha oseh v'reshith. And Abaye explains, as Rabbi Huna explained in the Yerushalmi, Abaye explains in the Bavli, this means after it's rained all night, in the morning the sky is very clear and the wind blows all the clouds away, and now it's a very clear, pristine, blue, bright blue sky. That's when you say the bracha on the sky, oseh v'reshith. So this happens with regards to the clear sky. This would happen a few times a year during the winter. And in Eretz Yisrael it would happen during the winter, during the rainy season, which is 4 to 5 months. This year is a bit strange, but usually 4 to 5 months in length. And it would happen maybe 2 or 3 times during the winter. You would have heavy rainfall, and the air would be cleared by this rain, and there would be strong winds, and the skies would be really clear. You would say this bracha.
You would make the decision. You would say this is clear to me.
Well, first of all, did it rain? Was there a good heavy rainfall, which really, cleaned the air, got rid of all the dust and what have you in the air, which is what happens when you have a good rainfall. And then the clouds disperse, and you have a bright sun, and you have a good wind, which blew all the dust and everything, all the clouds away, and now you just have this pure, bright blue sky.
It's up to you.
Well, who else is going to decide? It's not as if you can.
It's not measurable.
It's not something you can measure with some instrument. No, it should be something very obvious, really. But it's not going to happen every day. It's going to happen a couple of times a year, perhaps, something like that. In Chutz La'aretz, where maybe it rains more frequently, it could happen more often. It could happen 5-6 times a year, maybe more, I don't know. And then the Talmud Bavli goes on to discuss the bracha that we mentioned earlier with regards to the moon and the sun and the planets. Tenor Rabbanan, the Chachamim taught as follows: Haro'eh hama bitkufatha, he who sees the sun bitkufatha, levana bitkufatha, and also the moon bitkufatha, kochavim b'mesilotham. The lashon of the Bavli is a bit more expansive. It says he who sees literally the stars in their pathways, umazalot kasidran, and you see the planets in the sky. If you're familiar with the night sky, then you can recognize the most easily recognized planet is Venus, and then afterwards the next most easily recognized is Jupiter, which is the next brightest of the planets. And usually relatively near to Jupiter, you can also see Saturn, although it's not nearly as strong or bright. You can see Mars very often, not always, and you can usually tell because if you look carefully, it looks a little bit reddish, pinkish, or something like that. So if you're familiar with these things, you will notice. And what bracha do you say? Again, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam Oseh V'Reshith. Now, it states the following in the Talmud Bavli. Amar Abaye, when is this the case? When do you say this bracha? And he's referring to the bracha on the sun, obviously. Kol 20 shanin, every 28 years, Hadar mahzor, when the mahzor, the cycle of the sun, is complete. وَنَفَلَتْ تَكُفَتْ نِسَان بِشَرْثَيْ بُؤُرْتَى دِثْلَثْ نِرْهَ أَرْبَعٍ, which basically means when the beginning of Tkufat Nisan falls on Leil Revi'i, on the evening, the beginning of Wednesday, because the Torah speaks about the sun and the stars, etc., beginning to exist and be placed in the sky, as it were, on the fourth day. So now, what does this mean on every 28 years? What is a 28-year cycle? Are you familiar with a 28-year cycle? Do you wake up sometimes and see the sun and say, "Oh, there it is. Now we've reached the beginning of the cycle"? No, it's not something. It's not something visible. It's not something apparent. Yeah.
Is he under the impression that it's geocentric, that the sun orbits the Earth?
It doesn't matter. No, that doesn't matter. It's not relevant to this discussion, because the claim, according to this nusach, this girusa that we have printed before us, but as we're about to see, this is not the correct girusa at all. But according to this girusa, which the Rambam did have before him, okay, we're talking about what is called in astronomical terms the Julian year, as in Julius Caesar. In other words, we're talking about a solar year. You have a lunar year, which is 12 calendaric months, or you have a solar year, which is it doesn't matter right now whether you believe the sun is going around the earth or the earth around the sun, but you have a cycle whereby the relationship, the relative position of the sun to the earth it returns to the same spot every 365 and 1/4 days. That's a Julian year, okay, which is not a precise. That's not the precise astronomical reality. It's a little bit less than a quarter, but it's easier in terms of calculation. It's easier to say a quarter rather than say 0.23, etc. Many decimal places, which is the reality. What does that mean? That means that it works out that if you assume that a solar year is 365 and 1/4 days exactly, then every 28 years, the Tekufat Nisan, the beginning of that quarter of the year called Tekufat Nisan, which is around the beginning of Nisan, that day will fall on the Wednesday. In other words, you won't see it on Wednesday evening. The Tekufa begins in the evening, but you will see it in the morning, as the Rambam is about to explain. We'll read the Rambam in one moment. So there is a cycle, a 28-year cycle, according to that astronomical calculation, which, however, is not in fact precise. Not only is it not precise, it's also not the halachic standard. In other words, when we talk about Kiddush HaHodesh, we do not use that calculation. We use the calculation of Rav Ada. That is called the Tekufa of Shemuel. Shemuel, for astronomical purposes, Shmuel counted the solar year to be 365 and 1/4 days exactly, which, as I said, is also the Julian year, the Roman year. This was the standard figure in the ancient world, but it was already understood, even in those days, that this was actually not the most precise figure. And Rav Ada, amongst Chachmei Yisrael, was aware of this fact also, and he said, no, the correct figure is a little bit less, and this makes a difference when it comes to calculating Kiddush HaHodesh and whether you should add a month to the year, Ibur HaShana, etc., all these various things. And this also, by the way, leads to a discussion amongst some of the poskim, whether this bracha, assuming that you were to make this bracha according to this statement in the Talmud as it's printed before us, if you were to make this, to claim that you should make this bracha every 28 years, perhaps that's not the halacha. maybe this is according to Shmuel, who holds that the solar year is exactly 365 and 1/4 days. But if in fact we hold, for most halachic purposes, that's not in fact the case, then maybe this whole idea goes by the wayside. But the truth is, and this, by the way, what I'm giving now is not a full-length shiur on this topic. That would require, you would have to sit here for three hours at least. And we haven't got 3 hours, and it's involved and it's complicated. And I've also given this shiur before, more than once, in English and in Hebrew. So you can look it up and you can hear all the details. But here I'm giving the relatively brief version. What we have to first of all know is that in all the ancient sources, this idea of a bracha that is said once every 28 years does not exist. What does that mean? It means as follows. If you look at the Halachot Gedolot, which was written, which was authored in the early to mid 9th century, 840 or something, okay, Leminyanam, by Rabbi Shimon Kaira in Surah in Bavel. He quotes this statement as follows: Haro'eh hama b'tkufatha ulevana b'tkufatha v'chochavim b'mesirotam u'mazalot kesidram. Same words exactly that we saw before. Omer baruch oseh v'reshith. Very good, excellent. What's the problem? That's all he has to say. How am I supposed to know from this that you say it every 28 years? You just told me when you see the hama b'tkufatha, the sun in whatever that is, whatever that means, b'tkufatha, say this bracha. Okay, I'll do it. I'm happy. I'd like to do that. Just tell me when that is. What is b'tkufatha and when does it happen? According to the statement that we saw in the Talmud, it happens every 28 years. So then you would have to tell me in the Halachot Gedolot, this happens every 28 years. Abaye said so. He doesn't say so. He doesn't quote this statement at all. Similarly, if you look in the Rif quotes this same Bereithar from the Talmud Bavli, exactly that as the Halachot Gedolot, makes no mention of this supposed statement by Abaye that this is to be done every 28 years. And this is impossible. It cannot be. If this bracha is specifically to be said every 28 years, on a very specific day, on a Wednesday morning, once every 28 years, not more, not less, well then, that's an essential piece of information. It has to be stated. It cannot be left to chance, and it cannot be assumed. No one would assume that. If you told me, make a bracha on the sun, bitkufatha, okay, would I just assume or somehow understand that it means every 28 years? Of course not. You wouldn't. Especially if it's explicitly mentioned in the Talmud, in the name of Abaye, then why would you not quote this statement? So if you find, as we do find, that all the early sources quote this bracha, this braitha, without any mention of Abaye saying that it's to be done every 28 years, this is a very big question mark. This forces us to consider what exactly is going on here. And the fact is that there are many Rishonim who quote this statement without any mention of the 28-year, this additional piece of information about every 28 years, not mentioned at all. It also appears, for example, in Vayikra Rabbah, the Midrash Vayikra Rabbah, where it also just says when you see the Hama b'tkufatha, you say Baruch Oseh V'reshith. Doesn't say anything about 28 years. And the list is very long. All the number of Rishonim who quote this statement without any mention of a 28-year cycle is very great. So this forces one to consider what exactly has happened here. So how we discover and how I reach the definitive conclusion that this is a mistaken Girusa would be a long, lengthy thing to discuss and explain here. But the bottom line is that this statement of Abaye is some later addition, interpolated into the text of the Talmud. It didn't exist originally. It was not there. And that means that what most Jews are doing nowadays, and have been doing for quite a number of centuries at least, although I think it would be accurate to say that this is not an assumption, what I'm saying. I can tell you, in fact, even more very precisely, I think. The first time that anybody recited this bracha according to this shita, that it's once every 28 years. We have the first mention of this explicitly is by a Talmid of Rashi. Yes, Rabbeinu Shmaya, a Talmid of Rashi, and he's speaking about this subject in general. This is in a perush he wrote to a particular piyut, and some of this perush survived in manuscript, and he writes there that I saw this event take place at a certain time, he says. I won't go into the explanation of all this now. שלפני התשרי שהתחיל זתו. ואז זכינו לברך את החמה בבוקרו של יום רביעי ברוך עושה בראשית. So when was this? This was in Nisan Tau Mem Hey, the year 1085. This is during Rashi's lifetime interest. So apparently, and Rashi apparently also held the same, because Rashi's Perush on the Talmud includes an interpretation, an explanation of what this supposed statement of Abaye says. So apparently Rashi also had this reading in the Talmud, and this is when Rashi was 45 years old. So it seems that Rashi was of the same opinion, and probably did the same thing in that year. This is the earliest mention we have of anyone making this bracha on that particular day in Nisan at the beginning of the supposed 28-year cycle. Prior to that time, nobody speaks about such a thing. For example, Rav Saadia Gaon in his Sidur writes explicitly that you make a bracha on the sun, b'tkufatha, but when? He says you do it every year. B'tkufat Tammuz. Well, in other words, which is what is Tukufat Tammuz? That is the beginning of that quarter of the year when the sun is at its peak, or in other words, the peak of the summer, which falls usually on begins usually June 21st or June 22nd, according to the Gregorian calendar, because it's a measure of the sun, so you can't allocate attribute a Jewish date to it according to the lunar calendar, which means it's coming up soon, right? Which means it's 10 days away approximately.
Yeah.
This appears in other ancient sources as well, in a number of sources. Rabbeinu Bar-Hayim, for example, in two places says this explicitly, that this bracha is to be said around the time of Tkufat Tammuz. The difference is that Rav Saadia says beyond Tkufat Tammuz, mashma, that precise day, and other Rishonim like Rabbi Shlomo Rabbi Nathan in his Sidur and Rabbeinu Bar-Hayim say Bizman Tkufat Tammuz, which doesn't sound like it means dafka that day. It could be a few days before, a few days after. What is the definition of that day? That's basically what we call in English the summer solstice, right? The summer solstice is when the sun is at its highest point in the sky. In other words, the sun rises in the east, sets in the west, and in the northern hemisphere it goes through the south of the sky. Correct? In the southern hemisphere it's the other way around. But for now we're talking about the northern hemisphere. So it rises in the east, goes towards the west, but through the south, not directly above your head, unless you live in the equator, in which case it's directly above your head. It goes through the south and then sets in the west. in the winter months, the sun travels through the sky as we see it, as we perceive it, lower, and in the summer it's higher. Right? So the elevation of the sun is higher in the summer months than in the winter months. Right? So David here is nodding. So Samuel, he knows how to navigate, and there's been taught.
I planned my roof.
You planned your roof accordingly, right? So this is a reality. In the southern hemisphere, it's the other way around. The sun goes through the north, right? It travels from east to west, but through the north. Which is why in the northern hemisphere, if you wish to buy a home or an apartment with a sunny exposure, then you want an apartment or a house that has an exposure to the south. Correct? Windows and what have you to the south. But in Australia, for example, you do the opposite. You buy a house or an apartment with an exposure to the north, because that's where the sun is. If you live on the equator or around the equator, it doesn't make much difference. It's always directly above your head. So the fact that many, in fact not many, all the ancient sources make it plain that they did not have this reading in the Talmud about a 28-year cycle. In other words, I mentioned the halachot gedolot, I mentioned the Rif, I mentioned Rav Sa'ad Gaon, who says you say this bracha every year, once a year. I will also quote to you Rabbeinu Hananel. I'm sorry, actually before Rabbeinu, yes, let's quote Rabbeinu Hananel. Rabbeinu Hananel was let's say just before Rashi, okay? If you want to be precise, Rabbeinu Hananel was born in Daled Taushin Kaf Waw, 965, and was niftar in Daled Tau Tau Tev Zayin, 1055. In other words, Rabbeinu Hananel passed away 15 years after Rashi was born. All right. So Rabbeinu Hananel was essentially a generation before Rashi, different part of the world, in North Africa. He was in Tunisia. Rashi was in northern France. What does Rabbeinu Hananel write about this? He says, Yesh mi she'omer, there are those who explain, Haro'eh hama b'tkufatha, b'tchilat hamachzor kafhe, the beginning of the 28-year cycle, shenoferet hatkufa shel Nisan ba'oratha b'tchilatha nireh arba b'chochav shabtai, which happens on the evening, that the kufa begins on the evening of Wednesday, in other words, the end of Tuesday. That is the time being referred to by the Talmud. There are those who say, what does that mean? There are those who say, Abaye says so explicitly in the Talmud. Abaye says it happens every 28 years on this particular day. So it's not an opinion, it's not an interpretation, but Rabbeinu Hananel says it is. That's one pirush he brings. The other interpretation that he brings is actually more problematic, but Rabbeinu Hananel seems to combine these two statements about the sun and about the clear sky and what we saw in the Talmud, in both Talmudim, about after a good rainfall and the air is clean and now you see the sky. So when you see the sun in the clear sky, very clear and bright, after such a rainfall, then you would say this bracha. That's the other pirush he brings. But he brings two pirushim on something that the Talmud explicitly tells you exactly what it means. I said, well, how can you bring me two perushim? What is that? How are you expressing these two different opinions as if the Talmud doesn't say anything about this? Furthermore, I know you have a question, just a moment. In the Aruch, Rabbeinu Nathan Baal HaAruch, who was immediately after Rabbeinu Hananel, he was an older man when Rashi was a younger man. All right. In fact, there were apparently also some correspondence between Rashi and Rabbeinu Nathan Baal HaAruch. So he says, "V'chen haro'eh hashemesh b'zman koha v'tachlith tokpa." When you see the sun at the height of its peak of its strength, b'zman koha, when it's at its strongest, v'tachlith tokpa, yivarech oseh v'reshith. V'zeh yeh beferek tekufat Tammuz. That is at the time of tekufat Tammuz, which is the summer solstice.
Although it's the hottest in August.
We're not talking about heat. It's true. The highest temperatures are usually recorded in the northern hemisphere in July, August. That's true. But we're talking about when the sun's rays are the most direct and strongest and at the highest point in the sky. The actual ambient temperature of the air depends on other things. First of all, it keeps warming up over that time for another couple of months, so it tends to get hotter and hotter. But the actual strength of the sun, the strength of the sun's radiation, is at its peak at the summer solstice. That's when it's most directly above you. I'm sorry. What I just quoted now, I misread. I'm sorry. It was Rabbeinu Shlomo bar Rabbi Nathan is the one who said that. That was the other person I mentioned earlier. The Sidur Rabbeinu Shlomo bar Rabbi Nathan, who was apparently just after the Rif. Okay, he just like the Rif. He says you make this bracha in Tkufat Tammuz. With regards to Rabbi Nathan Baal Ha'aruch, he also brings two perushim. He says, when do you say the bracha on the sun? Perush Hama b'tkufatha b'tchilat machzor kafchet, beginning of the 28-year cycle. Then he goes on to explain what that means. Perush acher, another explanation. Hama b'tkufatha b'yamot, and then he goes on to bring the explanation of Rabbeinu Hananel, that it's after a rainfall and the sky is very bright and the sun is very clear. The sky and the sun are very bright, etc. Again, two perushim, when the Gemara gives you one perush explicitly. So these people, these chachamim, clearly did not have this girasa in the Talmud that we have before us. It cannot be. It's not possible. If some of them explicitly say that you make this bracha not every 28 years, but every year in the summer, at the time of the summer solstice, then you know that something is going on, something very strange. So I brought many sources here. I wrote this all up, and there are many sources here.
I still have a question.
Yeah, you have a question, so let's hear the question.
If it's every 28 years, why wouldn't it be in Elul when the sun was created? If something's repeating itself every 28 years, why not make the blessing?
Well, that would already depend on the mahloket of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua in Tishrei nivra ha'olam or Nisan nivra ha'olam. Some of the poskim have discussed this as well, but Inyan Zeh, they say we go like Rabbi Yoshua. It says B'Nisan Nivra Ha'olam. Okay. Either way, as I said, I cannot go into all the facts and information that I have gathered on this subject. I can tell you, however, part of the reason this confusion came to be. It has to do with an incorrect girasa that was added. That's number one. Number two, it has to do with the interpretation or misinterpretation of the word bitkufatha. Because this word can be interpreted hypothetically in two ways. Bitkufatha can mean at its strength, milashon tokef, right? Strength and power, like we just saw, and the sun is at the height of its strength and power, which is the time of the summer solstice. Ancient peoples were aware of this, right? All kinds of people, they had summer solstice, festivals and what have you, and all kinds of gatherings and sacrifices and what have you, because people saw this is when the sun is at its highest, and also they knew about the winter solstice when the sun was at its lowest and weakest. So you can understand the word bitkufatha milashon tokef, in which case it means ahama bitkufatha, at its strength, at its height, in terms of power. Or you can understand bitkufatha milashon nakaf, linkof, which means to go around in a circle, in a cycle. And these two interpretations we find explicitly amongst the Mefarshim. And this has a lot to do with the fact that the second interpretation, the 28-year interpretation, became the more accepted one. Because we have the pasuk in Tehillim. If you have Tehillim handy, you can look it up in Perek Yod Tet 19. So we have the pasuk Lamenaseach mizmor leDavid Hashamayim mesaperim kevod el u'ma'aseh yado magid harakia. In other words, he who looks at the heavens will immediately perceive the majesty and will be overwhelmed by what he perceives, what he sees. And then it goes on to say, Lashemesh sam ohel bahem. Hashem placed the sun in the sky. The sun is very impressive and powerful. Yasis kiribor larus orah. It's like a gibor. Mikseh hashamayim mosao. It leaves. It enters the sky at one place. Utkufatho al kasotham. And you can understand this to mean two things. We'en nistam yuhamatho. What is uthkufatho? The word uthkufatho appears therefore in the Tanakh. So Chazal are not making up this term; they're taking the term from the Tehillim. Uthkufatho al kasotham. In the Targum, it translates uthkufatho with thukpeh, its strength. So it's referring to the sun, at the strength of the sun. Minashon tokef. But, and this is how Rashi explains it. Rashi explicitly explains the pasuk in this fashion. Rashi says, "Utkufatho al kasotham, hakafat sibuvo mikaseh el kaseh." The hakafa, the sibuv of the sun, from east to west. That's what's being referred to. In other words, utkufatho al kasotham. In other words, it covers all the earth. Everything on earth is affected by the sun, feels the heat of the sun, sees the rays of the sun from east to west. Utkufatho. In other words, its hakafa is al kaseh, is all over, everywhere. Similarly, Rashi explains in Shemoth, we have the pasuk in Shemoth Lamed Daled 34, speaking about Chag HaAsif. Chag HaAsif, which is Sukkoth, Tekufat Hashana. What does that mean, Tekufat Hashana? Rashi says there, Tekufat Hashana Shehi Behazarat Hashana, when the year comes around again. Bethilat Hashana Ba, in other words, the end of the yearly cycle. So Rashi consistently explains that word kufatho in that way. Where did he get this from? We know where Rashi got this from. He got it from Dunash ben Labrat. Rabbi Adonim or Dunash ben Labrat was a grammarian and a parshan just a little bit before Rashi, and he explains that this word, in his view, is milashon, from the words that we find in Iyov Perek Aleph. Hikifu yemei mishteh. In other words, when the days of the mishteh, of the celebration, came to an end, in other words, the cycle was complete. So that's one pirush. But the other pirush is, as we said, we saw in the Targum, Tkufatho, he translates Tukpeh, its strength, the strength of the sun. Rabbeinu Tam at length explains why Dunash ben Labrat, and therefore Rashi's pirush, his grandfather's pirush, is incorrect. And he says, no, that's not what it means. And also, Menachem ben Saruk says that it means, it's Milashon Tokef. And he quotes the pasuk that we mentioned in Tehillim and in Shofetim. and Rabbeinu Tam agrees with this position. So what I'm saying briefly is this: the term Tekufatha or Tkufatho is used with reference to the sun already in the Tanakh. The question is, what does it mean in the Tanakh? That's one discussion. That's an important discussion, and there are two explanations. Okay. And then a second explanation is when Chazal use that term and they say Hama b'tkufatha, what do they mean? They can't mean both things. And there is a way to know exactly what Chazal meant. Because the Yerushalmi in Masechet Berachot in Perek Tef Halacha Beth, no, I'm sorry, that's where the Yerushalmi mentions the bracha on the sun. And in the first perek of Masechet Berachot on the Yerushalmi, it states as follows: Rabbi Omer, this is in Berachot Aleph Aleph in Yerushalmi. Rabbi Omer halevana b'tkufatha. What is that? Hitchil galgal hama lishkoa. The sun is setting. Utchilat galgal levana laloth, and the moon is rising. Zel ben hashemashot. When does that happen? That happens in the middle of the month, the middle of the lunar month. when as the sun is setting, the full moon rises. Okay, you can observe this usually quite easily. And it says Mefurash Yerushalmi, that's called Halavana B'Tkufatha. What does that mean? So what does that mean? That means when the moon is at its fullest, when it's at its brightest, when it's tokef, its strength, when it lights up and it shines at its greatest, more than any other time of the month. That's called Levana B'Tkufatha. That's Mefurash in the Yerushalmi. So you see, without question, that when Chazal use the term Levana or Hama B'Tkufatha, they are referring to the sun or the moon at their height in terms of their strength or their brightness. Okay, that is also why the lashon of that baraitha in the Bavli, where it says the correct girsa is Hama B'Tkufatha, Levana B'Tkufatha, but there are other girsaot with regards to the sun, with regards to the moon. It says that the Psalm says Levana b'taharatha. What does that mean, Levana b'taharatha? Again, taharatha means at its purest strength, when it's brightest. Also, there's also another girsa which says Levana b'gvuratha. What does that mean when it's most its greatest gevura? When it's brightest. When is the moon most impressive? When it's a small crescent, or when it's a big luminous ball in the circle or disc in the sky? So in some girsot it's referred to as B'Tkufatha, which is the original girsa. In others it's referred to as Levana b'Gvuratha. In others Levana b'Taharatha. But they're all referring to one and the same thing. In fact, there's even one very strange girsa in one version of the Vayikra Rabbah, where it says Halevana b'Chadura, when the moon looks like a ball. Well, that's as plain as it could be. It's not a correct girsa, but the reason for the girsa existing is because someone was trying to explain to you the term b'Tkufatha, which they thought you wouldn't understand, and they weren't far wrong. Many people didn't understand, so they wrote something else instead that would make it clear to you what's being meant. So it said Levana b'Chadura, when it's like a ball, which happens, we know when that is. And that's when it's at its brightest, obviously. And the same is true for the sun. Now, the sun doesn't wax and wane like the moon. The sun, however, is stronger and a higher point in the sky at a certain point of the year, the summer solstice, and less so than other times of the year. So, to sum up, then we'll take questions. The true meaning of this baraitha, this statement, which appears in the Tosefta and the Yerushalmi and in the Bavli, is that when you see the sun, both the moon also, by the way, there are two brachot on the moon. I should mention every month. One b'Hidusha, when the moon is at the brand new moon, and then you say Mechadesh Hodashim, and that should be said as early a point in the month as possible. So the first time you can possibly see the moon, that's when you should say the bracha. But the Avad, you can say it till the middle of the month, till Yud Dalet. And the other bracha every month on the moon, if you can see it, if you can observe the moon. If it's cloudy, you may not see it, but usually you can. And that's a full moon. And the full moon is usually, sometimes it could be Leil Yudad, more likely Tethwal, sometimes Leil Tetzain. And I'm also not convinced that if you said a Tethwal instead of Tetzain, it's any great ason. I don't think so. When the moon is at a very bright, powerful disk in the sky, you make the bracha Oseh Bereshith. So there are two brachot on the moon every month. Most people do not know this, but that's the fact. With regards to the sun, it's an annual bracha said once a year with Kufat Tammuz. So if you want to say it beyond Kufat Tammuz this year, it's coming up on, it's usually the 22nd of June. You can look it up right now, someone can look it up, because sometimes it's 21st. I think this year it's the 22nd, most years I think it's the 22nd, but maybe I'm mistaken, we'll check. And I also, as I said before, what does it say?
21st. 21st this year.
21st, right, yeah. So there's a 21st of June is the day of the summer solstice. That's the beginning of Tukufat Tammuz,
Wednesday.
and that's this year it happens to be also a Wednesday, and that's according to Rav Sadia. That's exactly the day to say it. Rav Sadia says B'yom, so maybe he thought Dafka the day, but I'm not convinced of that. I would think that just before or just after. I would say even as much as a week either way is okay, because the difference between one day and the next is not very noticeable, and most people in ancient times didn't have all kinds of astronomical aids and websites to look up and find out exactly if it's June the 21st or June the 22nd or what have you. They would see, they watched the sky every day. They told the time by looking at the sun. They were very sensitive to these things, much more than we are. So they would know that the sun is at its strongest and highest point in the sky, and this is the summer solstice. This is Tukufat Tammuz. People would be fully aware of this, certainly within a day or two of the occurrence, either way, and they would make the bracha. And that's when the bracha should be made. It's true, Rambam doesn't say this. Rambam says that you make this bracha every 28 years. And this is why, and because of Rashi also, and some other Rishonim also, although none of the earlier Rishonim, not one of the early sources, if you go back 1,000 years, before 1,000 years ago, no one had heard of the idea that there's a bracha that is recited every 28 years. It's unknown. In no source before 1,000 years ago. Around that time, this change occurred, and I connect this change to the Perush of Rabbi Dunash ben Labrat, who explained the pasuk in Tehillim, "Utkufatho al chesotham," to be referring to the cycle, the cyclical nature of the movement of the sun, which is a new Perush, but it's not the ancient Perush, as we see in the Targum, which explains it b'thukpeh. And there are many other reasons to differ with that Perush, but that's around that time, just over 1,000 years ago. That's when some people at least began to understand the term in the Tanakh that way, and maybe therefore began to understand the term in Chazal that way. But if in the Yerushalmi it's mefurash that Levana b'tkufatha means something very precise, namely in the middle of the lunar month when the sun sets and the moon begins to rise, that's Levana b'tkufatha. Well, that's the precise definition, and it's not possible really to disagree with that.
And that's when the days start getting shorter. It's like sort of an announcement, let people know that days are getting shorter.
In the summer, you mean? Like that's the longest day of the year, right? That is the day of the year when the most sunlight exists, right? That's correct. Yes. Okay, so that's with regards to this bracha. So. That is the correct time to recite this bracha. Questions?
Why is it talking about the rain if this bracha is set at the height of the sun? This is like the dry season. Like where'd the rain come in at? Like what's?
In truth, I don't think the rain has anything to do with it, but I don't think that Pirush is correct. I think it's a misunderstanding of what the Yerushalmi states. The Yerushalmi makes a statement about rain, but not with regards to when you make the bracha on the sun, but rather with regards to when you make a bracha on the clear sky. When is the sky at its clearest? That happens after a good rainfall and a strong wind, and then the sky and the atmosphere is completely cleansed of the dust and everything, and there's no clouds, and you have a bright blue sky. Then you make the bracha on the haroeh rakia b'teharo. That's what it's referring to. It has nothing to do with the sun. I agree with you. But there are those who made that connection. But really, I think it's a mistaken connection.
How do you go from the original Girsa, where people have a Masoret of saying the bracha every year with their father, I assume, or with their community, to where it's forgotten, and a new understanding?
That's a very valid question, but you should know you could and should in fact reverse the question, because we know from again there are many sources I couldn't quote now, but we know from various sources that in many communities, particularly in the Sephardi world, they never recited this bracha every 28 years. It was not done. There are also certain Ashkenazi poskim who very much doubted this bracha should be recited every 28 years. The fact that nowadays everyone seems to be doing it every 28 years, if you can talk about something, it's not a very regular occurrence. So you can't even talk.
1997.
Sorry.
When was the last time?
The last time was 2009. Right. 2009 was the last time. So when's the next one?
2037.
Oh, for some reason.
It happens. It doesn't happen very frequently. You cannot really discuss a minhag in terms of something that happens every 28 years. In other words, in most people's lifetimes, it's going to happen 2 or 3 times.
But was there a Tkufa where communities just weren't saying anything? They weren't, meaning...
I think so. Yes, it's a very strange halakha or reality in those terms. Yes, it seems. Look, if the halachot gedolah says you make this bracha, it doesn't explain when. The Rif says you say this bracha on the Chamar Tkufata, it doesn't tell you when that is. But Rasadia tells you, yes, I can tell you. Beyond Tkufat Tammuz. Rabbeinu Shmuel Rabbi Nathan says, I can tell you, but Tkufat Tammuz. Rabbeinu Bar-Hayim, who was a bit later even, in the time of the Rabbeinu Bar-Hayim was even after the Rambam, he says it's Tkufat Tammuz. So obviously there were communities, there were many Jews, many Chachamim, who were saying this bracha every year. But already 1,000 odd years ago, there were other communities who understood, who were being told, no, this bracha refers to something every 28 years. And there were other chachamim who said, there's something wrong about this whole thing. It doesn't make sense to me, so I'm going to say, Bli Shem or Malchut. There are some poskim who relate that so-and-so said, Bli Shem or Malchut. In some of the Achronim, it says that in the Sephardi communities, in Turkey and other Sephardi countries, they don't say this bracha every 28 years. In the Shulchan Aruch, it brings it every 28 years. That's true. It does. But it's a very unusual phenomenon. This entire concept is unusual. If we had more time, as I said, another 3 hours, then I could read the Rambam and explain to you why Rambam's explanation really cannot be accepted. Rambam explains the entire Baraithan according to a certain supposition, and he understands this 8-year cycle to be part of the whole question. But really the whole thing doesn't work, because according to Rambam, and let me just explain to you, for example, what Rambam does say to show you how unusual Rambam's statement on this matter is. Rambam writes, he says, you make this bracha every 28 years on the sun. Then he goes on to say, V'chen, this is Hadchot Brachot Yod Kaf. V'chen keshetachzor halevana lidchilat mazal taleh b'tchilat hachodesh. So you say this bracha at the beginning of the month on the moon, when the moon is in the constellation called Taleh. First of all, most people don't know when that is. Second of all, Rambam is saying explicitly this happens when? At the beginning of the month. He says b'tchilat hachodesh. And it's not every month, it's rarely, it's on rare occasions. But in Yerushalmi it says explicitly, Levana b'tkufata means when there's a full moon. It said when the sun sets and the full moon rises, that's Levana b'tkufata. So it's the exact opposite of what Rambam wrote. Rambam says b'tchilat hachodesh, Yerushalmi says b'emtza hachodesh. So it can't be both. Rambam goes on to say, "V'chen ki yachzeru kol kochav v'kochav mihameshet hakochavim." When the 5 planets reach a certain point in the sky, which most people have no idea when that is, then you make this bracha on each of the planets. In other words, on Jupiter, on Mars, etc. No one has any idea what this refers to. Now, it's worse than that. Some of these events that Rambam is describing occur every few thousand years. So who's supposed to know? Who's ever made such a bracha? Rambam's entire explanation is truly dumbfounding. It's very strange, very strange.
There's other opinions that are problematic in astronomy. He was just a product of his generation.
I'm not discussing his Rambam's astronomical knowledge, which was very great for his time. He knew as much about astronomy in his day as anybody on Earth, basically. But the idea that Chazal made the bracha that when Shabtai, the planet Shabtai, is at a certain once every 70 years you make a bracha, that's a very strange notion. There's no indication anybody's ever said such a bracha in every 70 years, or when it comes to other planets it's every 1,000 or 20,000 years. It's ridiculous numbers. Clearly no one ever, and the average person knows when Jupiter is in this particular point. They have no idea. How would you know such a thing? So it's a bracha for astronomers.
Yes, that's right.
No, the astronomer can let us know.
And if you happen to live in a village where there's no astronomer? which was the case for most people. so you know, again, I didn't go into all the details, but even in the Perush and the Rambam, in the excellent, this is, I don't think we have it here, do we? יש לנו פה את הרמב"ם עם הפירוש של מקבילי הקצר?
כן.
יש?
מאחורי הצלחות השטפות.
Yes, behind these plates, yes. Yes, pass me Sefer Ahava, please. I'll read this to you, just so you fully comprehend how unusual, even someone who's a Rambamist like Rav Makbili and other people who worked with him on this Perush, which is excellent. Their Perush is phenomenal. I recommend it very highly. But even they are forced to shrug their shoulders when it comes to this topic. Because let me read what it says here. It says, according to what Rambam describes, when the bracha should be recited on each planet, or each of the planets, the visible, observable planets, thank you. With regards to Mercury, it's every 1/4 of a year, every 0.24 years. With regards to Venus, it's 0.62 years. Mars, every 1.88 years. Tzedek, which is Jupiter, every 11.86 years, and with regards to Shabtai, Saturn, it's every 29.46 years. So you tell me what's going on.
So you need an astronomer to tell
you would have to be one of the leading astronomers of the generation to have any idea when these brachot would be recited. Now, with the numbers I just read to you about a quarter year, 0.62 of a year, 1.88 of a year, etc. This refers to the cycle of each planet in the observable sky. But that's not what Rambam is describing. Rambam says when each of the planets, וכן כשיחזרו כל כוכב וכוכב מחמשת הכוכבים הנשארים, all the other 5 observable planets, because those were the observable planets, at least in those days, when they get to Mazal Taleh, when they get to that constellation, ולא יהיה נוטה לא לצפון ולא לדרום. When that happens, you make the bracha. Now, when does that happen? He writes, I'm quoting, in their Perush, הדברים אינם ברורים. That's how he begins. Then he goes on to say, it's possible that the meaning is as follows, and then he explains what he explains, and then he says, it could be that he's referring to the precession of the equinoxes, which is something that happens every 25,800 years. All right, so if you have time, you can wait, and maybe you'll be lucky, and you'll be exactly, you know exactly when to do this. He says, "Habaya beve'ur zeh she'arambam emo beferush bechol et." Whenever this happens, and something that happens every 20,000 years is not a very common, not a very regular occurrence. So they're basically left shrugging their shoulders. It's really impossible to explain. The true Perush, well, I'll go into another time. It's actually very simple. It basically means, at length I'll explain another time. Now I'll just give you the bottom line. Rav Hai explains that when you see 2 or more planets together in the sky at the same time, for example, if you see Venus and Jupiter at the same time in the sky, which happens a lot in the beginning of the evening, then you make the bracha, so Bereshith. That's it. That's what Rav Hai says. You have to see 2 or more planets, 2 or 3, and or it could be Jupiter and Mars. It could be Saturn and Jupiter, whatever. That happens all the time. That's a frequent occurrence. That's what Rav Hai says. So first of all, you see, Rav Hai didn't agree with Rambam. Rav Hai was before Rambam. He was 100 plus years before Rambam, and considered one of the greatest of the Geonim. Some even claim the greatest of the Geonim, and he explicitly didn't understand this. And Rav Kook, by the way, Zetzal, understood this. Talmid of Rav Kook, Harav Dr. Benjamin Levin, Moshe Benjamin Levin, I think maybe was the name, or Benjamin Moshe Levin, something like that. he was close. He was sort of a Talmid of Rav Kook, and he was both a Chacham, a Talmid Chachamim, and an academic. And he put out the Otzar HaGeonim. If you're familiar with Otzar HaGeonim, he put that out, for example. He did a lot of work on the writings of the Geonim, and he put out a book in Rav Kook's lifetime in which this section from Rav Hai Gaon, his Perush of Masechet Brachot, is quoted. And Rav Kook went through it and added some footnotes. And he writes and he says this Perush of Hai Gaon is not like the Perush of the Rambam. He says explicitly. So I have no doubt that is the correct interpretation. It's all very straightforward. On the moon there were 2 brachot per month, on the new moon and on the full moon. On the sun is a bracha once a year, at this time of the summer solstice. If you live in the southern hemisphere, you do it at the time of the summer solstice then, which is December 21st, right, or 22nd, right, or 20th, whatever it is. That's an annual bracha on the moon, on the sun. The moon twice a month, on the sun once a year. On the planets, whenever you happen to see, for instance, you have a very clear sky, and you see some of the stars in a very bright and impressive fashion, you make the bracha. In other words, when the Spirit moves you, you asked before, Eliezer, so you decide? Yeah, you decide, exactly. If you look up into the heavens, HaShamayim mesaparim kavod el, u'maseh yado magid harokia, you look into the sky, you see these amazing things, and you have a very good view of this constellation of those stars. You make the bracha Sefer Reshith. It's not complicated. It's supposed to be an expression of hitpa'aluth, of one's breath being taken away by seeing these beautiful, amazing sights in the night sky. And the same is true for the planets, right? I mean, right now, if we look in the right direction, and not too long from now, we'll be able to see Venus, which is very bright in the sky in the west, right? And it's a very impressive thing to behold. It's brighter than any other object in the sky, except for the sun and the moon, in the observable sky. So, and that's of course why there were many ancient peoples that worshipped Venus. And as I understand it, the name of the capital city of Greece, Athens, comes from what?
Athena?
Athena, which means Athena, I have come, I have arrived, which has to do already with the claim that Venus was a body that entered our solar system, was captured by our solar system, which I think is probably true, but that's another discussion. So Venus was called Malkat HaShamayim. It's also referred to in Yirmiyahu as something like an expression which sounds like Malkat HaShamayim, the queen of the sky. It's very, very powerful and special, brighter and more impressive than any other object in the sky. And there's a reason why many ancient peoples, like the Romans, for example, worshipped Jupiter. Jupiter, of course, the Greeks called it Zeus. It's referring to the same thing, it's referring to the planet, Jupiter. Why? It's very bright. Compared to most other things, it's very bright. So all the ancient Avodah Zarah were based on heavenly bodies, worshipping heavenly bodies. Some people worship the sun. The ancient Egyptians worship the sun, right? And what have you. So none of this is surprising. In the Torah, we are instructed to be impressed by the Bria and to take note of the Bria and all these various sights that we can observe all the time, really. If we take the bother, if we're observant, and if we make a point of looking and seeing these things, we will see them, and connecting that to Hashem, the Boreh, rather than worshipping the object in the sky. We worship He who created the object in the sky. That's the huge difference between Am Yisrael and all other nations. I mean, ask yourself a simple question: why is Sunday called Sunday? It's the day of the sun. That's the God's sun. There's the sun god, and Monday is the moon god, etc., etc. Saturday is Saturn Day, the day of Saturn. Right? All the days of the week were named according to the gods, in their understanding, their primitive understanding, the gods were these heavenly bodies. It's only the Jews who decided that's all wrong. We refer to the days simply by numbers, precisely to avoid that trap. So we refer to Sunday as Yom Rishon, first day. Yom Sheni is not referring to any special object in the sky, because we're not interested in falling into that trap, which it was all the nations did fall into. Okay, so that's the end of that topic. Yes.
Two quick questions. How did Onkelos translate the verse that you mentioned?
That we don't have Targum Onkelos on that pasuk in Tehillim. Onkelos is on the Torah.
Not in Tehillim, in Shemot, Chag HaSif, B'Tchufat HaShana. Second quick question.
That's a good question.
The Talmud was corrupted.
Let's check it out.
Why was the statement not anonymous? Why was it attributed to Rabbi Lefka?
I think it was somehow probably written in by someone, because we see there was such a pirush, right? There were those who explained the statement of the Talmud to be referring to a 28-year cycle. This was written on the side of the page, on the gilayon of the Talmud in the manuscript at some point, which happens all the time. And it was written in such a way that it was later understood. Maybe it said Aleph Aleph, which could mean Amar Avraham or Amar Aharon or all sorts of things. And it was understood to mean Amar Abaye. And the explanation was the interpretation, the perush written on the side, was eventually introduced into the text. This happens all the time. People, if you're familiar with Talmudic manuscripts, this is a common occurrence. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'akol nהיה b'dvaro.
It's a clear sky. A couple days a year that I can see rumbling in the horizon. That would be a good indicator that it's a clear sky. So then I can make a bracha.
Lichora, that would be correct. I'll look up the Onkelos another time, but that's not for now. Yes?
A quick question. It's related only in the sense of the frequency of saying a certain bracha. Right now, when I pass the makom of the figua, I say the bracha shasali nes b'makom hazeh. The question is, do I say it every time, or do I say it only
Once a month?
once a month, or once?
I thought it was once a month.
That's a very good question. I would like to check before I give you a definitive answer, but it seems to me, without looking into it, that every 30 days is not necessarily relevant here, but maybe it is. I would have to look into it. I don't recall that such a thing is mentioned. Every 30 days is mentioned b'furash with regards to seeing Hayam HaGadol, right? When you see the Mediterranean, if you see it every day, you don't make the bracha every day. You say it once a month, or whenever the spirit moves you. But if you see it every day, you don't make the bracha every day. That's true about certain things, but it's not necessarily true for everything. But you could say that it would apply to that as well.
On a similar note, the rabbi did once say that it could be that when one is blessing Oseh Breshit on the two planets, there might be room to say that should be once a month, right?
It's also possible to make such a claim. Again, it's not 100% clear, I would say. The Maaseh, that's what I do. I don't say it every time I see two planets, but if I know that it's been a month since I saw the last time I said.
Because for rain, it's every time.
For rain, it's a different thing altogether. In Eretz Yisrael, we say a bracha in the usual winter months when it rains, the rainy season. We say a bracha every time there's any kind of decent rainfall, which means if it's been raining for 3-4 minutes and the ground is wet, you say the bracha, which is a tov v'mitiv. Good question. So this is in Shemot Lamed Dalet Kaf Bet. V'chag Shavuot Ta'aseh Lecha Bikure Kasir Hitim. V'chag HaAsif, and the Chag of Asif, which is Sukkot, Tekufat HaShana. Onkelos is Metargem. V'chagga Dichnasha, the gathering of the crops, Dichnasha, B'mipeka D'Shatha, at the end of the year. When the end, because that's it's describing the fact that it's the end of the agricultural cycle. Mipka, the outgoing of the year, because then the crops, let's say the wheat, was sown in late Tishrei, Mar Cheshvan. It grew. There was rain, and it grew throughout the winter months, and it began to ripen in the spring, and it was harvested in the summer, and it was all gathered in by Sukkoth. So Mipeka Shana doesn't really lean either way specifically. and even so, I would say more than that. Tekufat Hashana can be understood, perhaps even to mean a cycle, and the shoresh would be nakaf, nun kof pei, like Donash ben Labrat says. But when it says bitkufatha or utkufatho al kasotham, then it is very reasonable, in fact more reasonable, to explain it to be referring to the strength and the power of that object. Rabbeinu Tam explains this at great length. Rabbeinu Tam, most people do not know. Is this working? Rabbeinu Tam, most people do not know what a great Chacham he was in all areas of the Torah, including grammar. He was a tremendous mevin in dikduk, etc., etc. So there was Menachem ben Saruk, who wrote Mahberet Menachem, that Rashi quotes frequently, and he took many things from Menachem, and he says so. Occasionally, Rashi also followed the opinion of Dunash ben Labrat or Rabbi Adonim ben Labrat, who disagree with Menachem ben Saruk. They were rivals. And Rabbeinu Tam wrote a whole mahberet, a whole booklet or something like that, to prove that in almost all cases, in his view, Dunash ben Labrat was mistaken and Menachem ben Saruk was correct. And this is one example. He writes a whole beautiful piece, beautifully written. It's brilliant. It's amazing to read how he shows how plain and obvious it is to him that kufatho al kusotham refers to the power, the strength of the sun is al kusotham. In other words, it's felt by all on earth. You cannot escape the rays and the heat and the power of the sun.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.